In this video, we'll talk about U.S. foreign policy and certain international organizations. And foreign policy, that's just a government strategy for dealing with other nations. So every nation has their own specific way that they like to participate in the international community and interact with each other. And this relates to economic policy, military policy, and diplomatic relations. So let's start by talking about a very hot topic issue that's going on, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Some would call it a war, but officially it's still just considered a conflict. The UN Secretary General, he stated that continuing the war, he refers to it as a war, in Ukraine is morally unacceptable, politically indefensible, and militarily nonsensical. This situation that's going on, it's partially related to the Ukraine becoming more closely aligned with the West and toying around with the idea of potentially joining the European Union and NATO or NATO. We'll discuss these organizations here in a bit, but that's sort of what the conflict is about. Russia views this as a threat to their national security, and there are a million other reasons why this conflict is potentially going on, but we're not going to get into that fully. I just want to bring up the main point of these international organizations that exist and the fact that Ukraine has been seeking to join into the international community in a different way than it had previously done. So speaking about foreign policy, how countries interact with other nations, Ukraine has shifted their foreign policy in the last couple decades, and this has been seen sort of as a threat to Russia. There's been an international retaliation against Russia, not in direct warfare or anything of that nature, but more so there's been words taken against Russia, sanctions, and arms and ammunition supplies that have been given to Ukraine, mostly indirectly through third parties, not directly from the United States or these organizations, but this potentially may be happening as well, depending on what news source that you look at. There is some international support for Russia, Cuba, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and China, but China is also supporting the West as well. China's kind of playing both sides of the table right now, being with the West and with Russia. It's important to bring this up because this is the biggest policy issue that we see in the United States at the moment. So again, these major international organizations I mentioned NATO, I mentioned the UN, and I mentioned the EU. So the United Nations, this is an international organization that has created an international body of law. Almost every country in the world is part of the United Nations. There's the Organization of American States, the European Union. This is a collective, an economic collective of many European states under a common sort of economic and diplomatic policy. The World Trade Organization, Organization focuses on financial assistance to countries that need help. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, we've probably heard of this. These are oil exporting countries that this is typically their primary source of export revenue, and they can control oil prices and set prices. The North Atlantic Trade Organization, or NATO. So this is it's essentially a trade organization, but it's more so functions as a military alliance between European countries and the United States and Canada. Not all European countries, and that is where this sort of conflict arises between Russia and Ukraine again. NATO, it started after World War II and really was partly due or mostly due to the Cold War against Russia. So there's still some lingering anti-Russian sentiment with NATO. These organizations all started in the post-World War II era. So it really wasn't until these major world wars that the international community realized that there needs to be more alliances and a large international governing sort of body of law that all these nations can participate in to ensure that the world doesn't come to an end, essentially. So who isn't in the UN? So I said in the UN, the United Nations, it's most countries in the world are members. I should note here again, it was first started by the United States, Russia, China, and the United Kingdom in 1945, and then immediately following that, plenty of countries joined. 193 members. There are 193 members out of 195 countries, and the only two people that are actively non-members, or the only two countries, I should say, would be the Vatican, or the Holy See, and Palestine. So they purposely do not seek to be members of the UN. And then there are countries that are recognized by some countries, but not recognized by all. So they're not fully recognized members, but they are partially recognized members, and that would be Kosovo, Taiwan, and Western Sahara. So here we can see the European Union and which countries are member states of the European Union. So it's most of Europe, excluding the Balkan region where you have Romania, Serbia, Croatia, the former Yugoslavia, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation and Turkey are not members of the EU. Norway is also not a member of the EU. Switzerland is not. They tend to be very neutral all the time. And this map is a little bit outdated, where you see the United Kingdom, the island to the left of the continent. They recently exited the EU. Perhaps you heard in the news about Brexit. They decided to leave this sort of international European Economic Alliance for various reasons. The North Atlantic Trade Organization, or NATO, we can see here all the member states of NATO, Canada, the United States, much of Europe, Turkey as well, but typically countries that are bordering Russia or close to Russia are not members of NATO. When Turkey joined NATO in the 60s, that's when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Russia thought to bring nukes or weapons to Cuba, and that was going to be a huge crisis because the United States did not want Russia to be, or the Soviet Union, I should say, to be in the sphere or territory or region or area where the United States was. Russia, they took Turkey being part of NATO as NATO sort of encroaching on Soviet territory. And that's sort of a similar situation with Ukraine, but again, that's a complicated situation, and there's more to the story than just alliances, international alliances. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So which countries are part of it? We can see here you got Ecuador, Venezuela, Algeria, Nigeria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Gabon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. And we can see just how many billions barrels that were exported circa 2014. But these countries have a significant amount of oil that they export, and they're in an alliance together to sort of help each other out economically and be able to control, so to speak, the prices of oil, typically in their favor. And yes. Okay, world economics, ideologies, and populations is worth noting here too. So we can see kind of how these alliances might form, how and why. So countries that have similar or somewhat similar ideologies in economics tend to align with each other. And the Western world, when we talk about the Western world, we're talking about the United States, Canada, and most of Europe, Western and Northern Europe, and to an extent Eastern Europe, but typically not. Eastern Europe is not considered part of the West, but they are sort of similar in some ways with economies and ideologies, but really not. They're more so, they have the legacy of the Soviet Union and communism there, and sort of a different style of history. So there's a reason why the United States aligns with Western and Northern Europe, and that's because the political ideologies and the economies and the people that live in these areas are quite similar. And that's sort of similar with OPEC in a way. They have some commonality that allows them to want to align with each other. Australia, too, we could sort of consider Australia part of the Western world, even though they're in the, they're kind of off down under. But that's also a Western country. So it's just these countries that have a similar economy, ideology, and population, and typically this is liberalism or liberal conservatism that we see in the Western world. I hope that's clear and makes sense. I know it can be kind of confusing because in the United States, when we talk about the West, we typically mean the cowboy country where you go out west, you have the Wild West, but really the West just means Western Europe, Northern Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia, New Zealand. That's the West. The East, that can mean Eastern Europe, that can mean China and Asian countries. And that's, so that's sort of what we think when we say the East versus West. It's like there's different ideological views in each part of the world, and based on different history, different peoples, and different ways of approaching the economy. So let's go back here to now the UN. So we said almost all countries are part of the UN. And being a member of the UN is essentially acknowledging that there is international law that every country needs to abide by. And it emphasizes strongly human rights. So the UN, they have something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there are 30 different articles that outline various rights that we have or outline to this declaration itself. And what these rights are, I'll try to quickly go through them here, but I also encourage you to pause the video and read, and maybe look online yourself to read the full declaration. So just going through them here, number 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, so everybody's equal. Everyone's entitled to those rights and shall not be discriminated against. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. 4, no one shall be held in slavery and the slave trade is prohibited. 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. 6, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So you have the right to be recognized before the law no matter where you are. No one shall be discriminated against or denied protection by the law. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by their national body of law if their fundamental rights are violated. So your country must have a solution for you if your rights are violated or your fundamental rights are violated. There has to be some remedy for this at the national level, so at the state level, at the country level. 9, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, so you can't just be arrested for no reason. 10, everyone is entitled to full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal when determining his rights. 11, these are summed up pretty concisely here, these following rights. So 11, you have the right to presumption of innocence. 12, you have the right to no arbitrary interference in your home, family, or in your privacy. 13, anyone can move freely within their country, and you have the right to leave your country if you want. 14, if needed, you can seek asylum in other countries. 15, you have the right to a nationality, and you have the right to give up your nationality if you want. But everyone has the right to be a nation somewhere. 16, everyone has the right to get married and have a family. 17, everyone has the right to property. 18, you have the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. 19, freedom of opinion and expression. 20, you have the right to freedom of a peaceful assembly. 21, the freedom to participate in government, and you have equal access to public service. 22, the right to Social Security. 23, the right to work and the right to form trade unions. 24 is a right to rest and leisure, and that means that you have the right to have time off and a reasonable limitation of working hours. 25, the right to an adequate standard of living in your country. 26, you have the right to education. 27, you have the right to participate in the cultural life of the communities. So that means you have the right to arts and to share in scientific advancement. And those that created art, they also are protected. Their moral and material interests are protected as well. 28, you have the right to social and international order as what's outlined in this Declaration of Human Rights and set forth by the United Nations. And 29 and 30, well, for 29, it states that everyone has a duty to their community and we all need to respect each other. And 30 says that no country can engage in anything that will destroy these rights and freedoms that are all listed here. So there are quite a few similarities to what we see in the United States with our ideals and our rights that we outline in both the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. So there are similarities. We see the protection of thought and conscience, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and the idea that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So the Declaration here of Human Rights for the UN is based heavily on dignity and respect for all of humanity. So based on the fact that we're humans, according to the UN, we all deserve certain fundamental rights as human beings that other countries should not infringe upon, and the country we live in also should not infringe upon. So this is sort of holding every country that's a member of the UN to a certain standard with their own government that they have at their own level, at their own country's level. However, this doesn't always happen, of course. So countries, even though they are members of the United Nations and say that they agree with all of this, this doesn't necessarily play out in reality. And if it doesn't, there isn't much that one can do. So for example, the United Nations is saying that Russia is violating certain human rights in Ukraine and that the war is absurd, as the Secretary General of the UN stated. But there isn't so much that the UN can do to hold other member states accountable. They can impose sanctions. They can put this kind of economic and diplomatic pressure on countries. They can condemn what's going on and say, no, that is bad. You may not do that. But that's sort of the extent to it. It's not a military body. So countries kind of can do what they want in a way, so to speak. So really, like, the UN operates on the honor code. There are these rights listed out, and one should follow them and be accountable to following them, but there isn't a ton of accountability, but there are measures that can take place. Like I said, sanctions and this sort of international condemnation of countries that may be doing something that doesn't line up with what the UN stands for. We'll go over here a couple different conventions and doctrines. So the Geneva Conventions here. So the Geneva Conventions, these are 4 treaties and 3 additional protocols that establish international legal standards for humanitarian treatment in war. So we talked about human rights and certain non-military things that can be done against countries that the UN discusses, sanctions and whatnot. And there are also protocols that are in place and treaties when it comes to war. There are certain things that must be done in war. We can't, or things that must not be done in war. So torture is something that should not be done in war, and being part of the international community means that one will abide by these rules. So this was created after World War II, and it was necessary to create this kind of military law to prevent atrocities that occurred from ever happening again. And here, so military necessity, along with distinction, proportionality, humanity, sometimes called unnecessary suffering, and honor, sometimes called chivalry, are the 5 most commonly cited principles of international humanitarian law governing the legal use of force in an armed conflict. So this is not saying war is okay, but if war must happen, there are certain measures or things one needs to keep in mind and not do, because we all, again, like the very first human right in the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN states that we're all born equal and free and our dignity should be protected. So that applies to military conflicts as well. The Bush Doctrine, so this doctrine, this was put into place back during the War on Terror, after the 9/11 attacks, and it essentially outlines a preventative strike. And so it affirms the legitimacy of a preventative strike and emphasizes the notion that if you're not with us, you are against us. So this, the Bush Doctrine was, it sort of altered international law in a way, because according to international law, it's very rare that one should ever go to war, and there should be very clear criteria to go to war. But George W. Bush, following the terrorist attacks and 9/11 in 2001, he sort of shifted it a bit to, in a way, justify being able to go to war with Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's based on the next doctrine here, the Powell Doctrine. So if we look at the Powell Doctrine, this states that a list of questions all have to be answered affirmatively before military action is taken by the United States. And one can ask themselves, one should look at this Powell Doctrine here and ask themselves, does this align with the Bush Doctrine? And does this align with other wars that the United States has entered into? And do you think that this doctrine here is fair or right? Are these questions necessary, or are there exceptions, or are there other questions we should ask? So these are just 2 doctrines to consider. I'm not arguing either one is right or wrong, just that you all should know them and be aware of them and consider what you think. Do you think that a preventative sort of strike is justified or not? And do you think that these questions here that Powell outlines in his doctrine, are they legitimate? Are they good ones to answer? And do they cover the concerns that the Geneva Conventions and the UN have? Do they address those concerns? So 1, is a vital national security interest threatened? Yes or no? 2, do we have a clear, attainable objective? 3, have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Have all other non-violent policy means been fully exhausted? Is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Have the consequences of our action been fully considered? Is the action supported by the American people? And do we have broad, genuine international support? So these are really great questions to consider when entering a war. They're great strategic questions to consider as well, even from a military standpoint. All right, so generally speaking, though, in the United States, who takes care of foreign policy? So we spoke about military, spoke about international organizations. So how does the United States actually function or look at foreign policy within the context of our country? So foreign policy, that's taken care of by the executive branch and the Department of State, with the Secretary of State being the main advisor to the president when it comes to foreign policy. Congress also looks at foreign policy, and it's only Congress that can declare war. So we can say that there's two types of foreign relations or foreign policy. You have diplomatic, which means alliances and communicating and talking with other countries. And then you have military sort of relations. And typically that should be a last resort sort of thing. We don't want to jump into a war immediately. That according to American foreign policy, it's better to try to work things out non-militarily first. And once that's been exhausted, then we send the military. So the executive branch and the Congress, they have constitutional responsibilities for foreign policy. Within the executive branch, the Department of State is the lead U.S. foreign policy agency, and the Secretary of State is the president's principal foreign policy advisor. Just to sum that up neatly for everyone. The U.S. Department of State, they have a list here of different policy issues that they have deemed important and that they consider requiring international cooperation. And I take a moment here to pause the video and go through these various policy issues that the U.S. Department of State is taking care of. Some in their description are kind of broad or left out for interpretation, but it's sort of clear here what it is that the U.S. Department of State is working on, and this is what is important for U.S. foreign policy. And it's not in order of importance; it's just in alphabetical order. The current U.S. Secretary of State, or the main advisor to the president on foreign policy, is Antony Blinken. And he's been a security advisor since 1994 in some various capacity, and he's worked under various Democratic administrations. So we can have a look here at this chart, and it shows which departments that he worked with, not really departments, but more so which sectors that he worked for the state or local government or for the federal government, and for how much of a period of time. So he's really been working with national security sort of relations since, again, 1994 in various sectors. Yes. And he was in the private sector for a bit as an advisor, but then came back and has been working under the executive branch under the Biden administration. So historically, though, U.S. foreign policy, well, the Department of State was created in 1789. It was one of the first bureaucratic departments that was created because, of course, the United States needed to be able to interact with the international community. At first, it was seen more so necessary because of commerce and being able to trade with the international world, but it quickly became military as well. It didn't take too long for the United States to enter into war with Great Britain again in the early 1800s, the War of 1812, for example. There has been a different approach to foreign policy throughout the years, and there was an instance where the United States, viewing itself as part of the New World, saw itself in a more isolationist sort of way regarding foreign policy. And that meant that the United States would only interact with the international community if they absolutely needed to, and more so regarding commerce. But otherwise, it was sort of like, let the United States live in their own little perfect bubble and not deal with anything going on in the rest of the world. At some point in time, you could argue, following the world wars, the United States became more of like this police dog in a way for the world, and there are many entanglements that the United States has throughout planet Earth. So it's not just the United States for the United States. The United States is all over the place. And this really changed primarily in following the Spanish-American War in 1898. That's when the United States sort of transformed from a republic to an empire, because the United States acquired territories at that time, Guam, Puerto Rico, and a couple other territories as well. So over time, the United States has become more and more involved in world affairs. And in one hand, we can say we have entanglements everywhere, but on the other, you can say we have alliances in tons of different places. And foreign policy, how the United States interacts with other nations, it depends a bit on the administration that's in and how the United States sees itself as a nation. And that is something that is still up for debate. It's not totally clear how much the United States ought to participate in the global arena. On that note, foreign aid, the United States also gives assistance to countries around the world. So we're not just aligned with people that have similar ideological and views and economies as us, and we're not just at war or entangled in certain things. We also give money to a lot of different countries. And so the definition here of foreign aid, it's aid given by the United States to other countries to support global peace, security, and development efforts and provide humanitarian relief during times of crisis. So a lot of it has to do with security, peace, and trying to develop countries that may or may not be in some kind of crisis. This is the 2022 map showing where we send most or all of our foreign aid. And I encourage you to check out the foreign aid governmental website, because we can look and see that in 2021, we gave foreign assistance to the Russian Federation. And as a result of this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, Russia is no longer receiving foreign assistance from the United States. But so far, by mid-April 2022, we've given $5 billion to other countries. It will definitely increase as the year goes on. 2021 versus 2022 managing agencies, I think it's worth looking at here that when we look at the federal bureaucracies in 2021, a bunch of different departments dealt with foreign assistance. The primary one was just an agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and other agencies dealt with it too, or departments. You have the Department of Defense, Department of Treasury, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Peace Corps, Department of Agriculture, Department of State, Department of Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, and then a bunch of others also dealt with it. 2022, that changed, and now it's all under the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is probably good when we talk about bureaucracies, that a lot of times there's departments that have overlap in what they're doing, but now all of this financial assistance, or this foreign assistance, went to this one sort of managing agency. Also, let's see which sectors that the money goes to, and it primarily goes to health and humanitarian assistance, also to education and promoting democracy as well, and economic development. We'll end the video here with a question. Just think here, do you agree or disagree, or what do you think when you hear this quote by Thomas Jefferson? Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. So for Thomas Jefferson, if we look at historical foreign policy in the United States, he was probably more so an isolationist. And he saw the challenges that may arise if there are certain alliances that may entangle the United States. So that's a sort of quote here to consider and ask yourself if you agree or disagree. It's a different time that he would have said this in compared to now, because we have a much more globalized community than back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So the community is a much more global, and it's not necessarily possible to isolate ourselves in a way that would have been possible in the 1800s. So on that note, think about the United Nations, the EU, this conflict or war between Russia and Ukraine, and think about human rights that are outlined by the United Nations and how they line up with American political ideals and things that we've discussed throughout this course, that certain American political values that were outlined in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, conservative ideals, liberal ideals. How does this all wrap up into how we interact with the rest of the world?